This episode is brought to you by My Kentucky Tea. Subscription teas, Kentucky inspired. On this episode of Bourbon Night, we're going to give you a class in Bourbon 101.
Plus, we're going to be blind taste testing the top 4 best-selling bourbons in the U.S.
Oh, it's Bourbon Night, we're gonna do it right, we're gonna have a class to begin, yeah. Oh, it's Bourbon Night, we're gonna do a flight because it feels so right, my friends. It's Bourbon Night.
It's Bourbon Night. I'm Chad.
I'm Sarah.
And on this episode, we're going to delve into the basic things that you need to know about bourbon.
Plus, we're going to be blind taste testing the top 4 best-selling bourbons in the U.S., which are Maker's Mark, Jim Beam White Label, Evan Williams, and Wild Turkey 101. Stay tuned for that. However, if you are proficient in bourbon, you feel free to skip ahead and just go ahead and get to the flight. But we suggest you stick around because there might just be a little nugget of information in here that you didn't know you didn't know.
You didn't know you didn't know. So you never know, you know? So stick around. Let's start Bourbon 101. Classes in session. So let's start off with something that sounds more like a riddle than a fact. All bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. This is basically just a way of saying that bourbon is a category of whiskey.
So take music, for example. You've got tons of categories of music. You've got hip-hop, rock, classical, and jazz. I'm sure you've heard of other types of whiskey. Canadian, Scotch, Irish, rye, and so on. So some of those are organized by geographical locations, like all Scotch is made in Scotland. But some of those can also be determined by the primary grain that's used in the recipe.
Yeah, that's right. So with bourbon, the primary grain is corn. So that means by law, 51% of the recipe has to be corn, but it's typically more around 70 to 80%. Now the rest of that recipe is malted barley and most typically rye, though some distillers take out the rye. They substitute that for wheat. Now this recipe is known as a mash bill.
So you may have heard someone refer to a bourbon as a wheater or a wheated bourbon. And what they're referring to there is that wheat is the third ingredient in the mash bill instead of the rye. Wheated bourbons tend to be known as having a sweeter or milder taste, and that's not because of the addition of the wheat, but because of the absence of the rye. And also, wheat is not as dominant of a grain, so it really lets the sweetness of the corn show through, and that's where those flavors are coming from.
So now on to a well-known fact about bourbon. All bourbon has to be made in Kentucky. Well, if you're talking about Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey, then yes, but otherwise, no. And trust me, this is coming from a born and raised Kentuckian. The fact is that bourbon can be made anywhere in the United States, but only in the United States.
And that's been the case ever since a congressional resolution in 1964, which makes bourbon America's only native spirit. And the really cool thing about bourbon is that there's only 3 main ingredients used to make it, which are water, grains, and yeast.
The only thing to add coloring to the whiskey is the barrel. The wood, also imparts other flavors as the whiskey soaks into the wood in the colder months, and it sweats out in the hotter months. Thank you. No artificial flavorings or dyes or added coloring, anything like that can be added. It's only the alcohol, the wood, and time.
And you might ask, why is water added to the bourbon?
Why is water added to the bourbon?
Well, the answer, Chad, is to proof the bourbon down. So your 80 proof bottle of bourbon didn't come out of the barrel at 80 proof. It was proofed down using distilled water. And you'll notice if you look at your 80 proof bottle next to a 100 proof or higher bottle, you'll see that the bourbon in the 100 proof or higher bottle is going to be a lot darker.
Bourbon is the most heavily regulated spirit on the market today, which brings us to the 5 laws of bourbon.
Law number 1 is that bourbon must be made from at least 51% corn.
Bourbon must be produced in the United States.
Bourbon must be aged in a new charred oak container. Now, a side note on that, Scotch whiskey is allowed to use used barrels. In fact, a lot of used bourbon barrels are sent to Scotland to age Scotch. Others are used for tequila, beer, Tabasco sauce, bitters, and so on.
The whiskey going into the barrel must not be higher than 62.5% alcohol by volume, which is 125 proof.
And whiskey must not be bottled any higher than 80% alcohol by volume, or 160 proof, and no lower than 40% alcohol by volume, or 80 proof.
So for those of you paying attention, you might be saying,
But you didn't say anything about the amount of time the bourbon has to stay in the barrel. My friend told me for any whiskey to be called a bourbon, it has to be aged for like 2 years.
Well, your friend is drunk. Tell him to sleep it off. Now, if your friend had said straight bourbon whiskey, they would have been right. Also, you said something else in there that wasn't technically correct, but we're going to get to that in a minute. But yes, for the word bourbon to appear on the bottle, there is nothing in the laws that stipulates the amount of time it has to mature.
The distillate or unaged whiskey, also called White Dog or moonshine, could technically spend a minute in a new charred oak container and still be called bourbon. Just don't ask me to try it.
Or me, no.
But if anyone fights you on that, tell them to look up Hudson Baby Bourbon. It's made in New York, and when it first came to market, it was only aged for 3 months. Nowadays, it's aged for longer.
Yeah. So there are age requirements for categories of bourbon, but first, let's go back to something you said a minute ago.
But you didn't say anything about the amount of time it has to stay in the barrel.
Why don't you talk like this all the time? I kind of like it. Yeah, notice we didn't even say the word barrel. It doesn't even have to be a barrel. Yes, the industry standard is a 53-gallon barrel, although distillers do use other sizes occasionally. Case in point, the Hudson Baby Bourbon. But the point is, you could use a square box, and as long as it met all the rules of bourbon, that whiskey inside would still be considered a bourbon.
So, separate from the laws set in place by Congress, you have rules that the distillers must follow for the labels on their bourbon bottles. These rules are set in place by the U.S. Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, or TTB for short.
Yeah, you know me. So this is where you get laws such as if a bourbon is younger than 4 years old, it must be reported on the label. Now, for this, you can round down, but not round up. So in other words, if your whiskey is 23 months old, you can call it a 1 year, but you can't yet call it a 2 year. That's correct. You were ahead of me the whole time.
Also, if the distiller is combining different ages of bourbons, they have to report the youngest one on the label. So, for example, if the distiller is combining an 8-year-old bourbon and a 6-year-old bourbon, 6-year-old is what will appear on the label.
Now let's talk about where age requirement does come into account. That's right, we're breaking down bourbon into subcategories, much like if you said rock is your favorite type of music, you might break that down into its genre of hard rock, punk, pop, or symphonic, post-progressive, speed, thrash, grindcore.
I love that one.
You do.
I love
She loves that. Luckily for us, bourbon doesn't get that crazy with its categories. For bourbon, we have straight blended, and bottled and bond.
Straight bourbon whiskey must be aged for a minimum of 2 years.
That's where a lot of people get that, bourbon has to be aged 2 years, but they don't realize they're talking about straight bourbon.
Ever seen Mila Kunis in a Jim Beam commercial saying that Jim Beam is aged twice as long? That's because Jim Beam is a straight bourbon whiskey and their white label is aged for 4 years. Now, straight bourbon whiskey mixtures are allowed, but they must be 2 or more straight bourbon whiskeys, and they all have to be produced in the same state.
Next, we have blended bourbon whiskey, which means the blended whiskey included must contain no less than 51% blended straight bourbon whiskey, excluding added alcohol content from adding agents of coloring or mixture or so forth. So basically, as long as 51% of the mixture it meets the laws of straight bourbon whiskey, it can be included, but that other 49% can be a mixture of other spirits, coloring, flavoring, added agents. It's just, you don't know. You don't know what's in there.
So, blended straight bourbon whiskey is when everything in the mix is not only bourbon, but is straight bourbon. And in this category, they don't all have to be produced from the same state. So, for example, if a distiller is combining Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey and Colorado straight bourbon whiskey, they can be combined together as a blended straight bourbon whiskey, and that's what would go on the label.
Yeah, but though let it be known that since it is older than 2 years, it doesn't have to say straight. That is a decision of the distillery. And the most regulated and restricted bourbon category of them all, the bottled and bond bourbon. For bourbon to receive this designation, it must be the product of one distillation season by one distiller at one distillery. Also, it must be stored in a federally bonded warehouse, aged for at least 4 years, and bottled at exactly 100 proof.
That's right, and the bottle also must identify the distillery, where it was distilled and bottled. Why is so much detail required for these bottled and bond bourbons, you might ask?
I'm asking.
And that all goes back to the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897, or the first Quality Control Act set forth by congressional legislation. And this was so that proprietors couldn't add things to their whiskey to make it look and taste older.
What is one of the most unthinkable things being added to whiskey back then? Try kerosene or arsenic.
It's disgusting.
And now for our flight fight, we decided to choose the 4 best-selling bourbons around nowadays. So that is Jim Beam, Maker's Mark, Evan Williams, and Wild Turkey. We chose these because if you were to wander into a Applebee's, first of all, you're at an Applebee's, get out!
Run!
Run!
Save yourself!
Or no Charlie's or a Chili's or whatever. What they're most likely to have behind their bar. So we're going to try these blind and let you know what we think, if you're in one of those situations, is the best one to have. So,
Let's do it.
let's do it. And here we are once again, another flight fight. We have the 4 top-selling bourbons. We're going to try them, starting with letter A. We switched to letters.
We
now.
switched to letters because the numbers and then putting them in orders 1 through 4 favorite. There was a lot of math and
Yeah.
I didn't like it.
Ugh, hate math. Woo! Woof.
I'm not a fan of that one.
What's unique about this is 3 of these were in our last flight, the 50 under 25.
So I'm afraid to bash it because
Right.
what if it did well? Not that I shouldn't be afraid to bash it. I
No.
mean, it either did well or it didn't.
Yeah.
But this is very sweet. It's really I don't know.
This one leaves my tongue dry. It's way too I'm trying to be something that I'm not.
Right.
It's like,
Now, I will say that this one's really smooth. There's no burn to it. But I would pretty much suspect that for a top-selling bourbon. I mean, people don't tend to love the burn, so
I'm going to have to cracker it up, folks.
yeah. Cracker time. I love cracker time.
On to number B.
To number B. It's hard to get the first one out of my mind to think about.
Let it go. Just let it go. This one is also...
Ooh.
Hello.
Sorry.
This one tastes a little bit more familiar, maybe.
Oh, I'm still getting some burn. I mean, I like this one better even though it burns just because I don't like how sweet the first one is, so. C is sort of a mixture for me in between the first 2. It's sweet, but it also smells like there's something else going on.
I'm not liking C either. It's not very approachable.
I like the flavors in B better, but I like that C didn't make me go, woo! B made me so,
I'm sorry, how did that go?
Woo!
Woo, woo, woo. Okay. Letter D. Number D. DD.
I have the aftertaste. Yeah, it had me until the aftertaste. Ugh. What is that? Oh.
I like my D.
You're a fan? Fan of the D?
Fan of the... Oh, and I see the problem with this. We're going back to numbers. It's so cold in the D.
Ugh.
Official review from Sarah Algram. Ugh.
But the aftertaste is, it's smooth. I'm not getting any uncomfortable feelings off of it except for the aftertaste. It's at first I was like, oh yeah, this is going to be the one. This is my favorite one. All of a sudden, in a split second, it changed to my least favorite one, I think. Just because of that aftertaste. It just tastes kind of earthy, but not in a good way. Still not a big fan of A. Still too sweet.
C is forgettable.
That's how I feel about A. It's forgettable. These are such absolutes to be speaking in. It makes me scared. I just really don't like the aftertaste of D.
B, I feel like has more going on. B might be the Wild Turkey 101. I feel like it's maybe a little higher proof.
I feel like you should to be or not to be in your quiz we're walking about.
To be, well, not to be. That is a question. And D, now going back to it, is much less complex, much less flavorful. Okay. So, we'll be right back with the results of our top-selling bourbons right after this. Having one of those days. Just can't seem to do anything right? Do you need a little pick-me-up? Have you checked the mail today? Remember a couple weeks ago when you signed up at mykentuckytea.com? It was so easy. You went to mykentuckytea.com and now you'll receive a new Kentucky-inspired tea each month that celebrates the Commonwealth. It's just $15 a month, and that includes your tea, shipping, and tax. Just pick your t-shirt size and you're in business. There's no contracts and you can cancel at any time. But why would you want to do that? If you like, you can order 3, 6, or 12-month packages, which work great for gifts. Visit mykentuckytea.com, and while you're there, you can even inquire about their custom design and print work. mykentuckytea.com. Subscription teas, Kentucky inspired. Delivered right to your door for only $15 a month.
And we're back. We are going to do our results in just a minute, but we just saw the My Kentucky Tea little commercial sponsorship. So we both have My Kentucky t-shirts on right now, which you can find. Yeah, please view. Go to their website, get your shirt.
$15?
I mean, you really can't beat that. But anyways, I like them. I mean,
Yes.
love them. You have multiples, so.
Yeah. Let's do results. That's why we're here.
So, Chad's last choice was letter A, which was Maker's Mark. So,
Interesting.
Chad's second to last choice was letter C, which is Evan Williams.
Huh.
Which means that
This makes
Jim
sense.
Beam and Wild Turkey 101, which fared well for you in the 25 or 50 under 25
flight. Yeah.
that he stayed true to some of that
Yeah.
on some level.
Yes.
It's real. It's happening.
It's happening.
Okay, so what do you want to know first?
Go hand me my winner.
Your winner.
Go hand it to me.
Your winner is
Put it in my
B.
hands. Put it in my hands. Oh, it's Wild Turkey.
it's Wild Turkey 101.
Which I called.
You did.
Here's the thing. This made it to my final round, my 16th flight of
But
4.
None
This
of
one
those
did.
were here, right? None of these going up against it. And that were from last show.
Correct. All's right with the world.
In Chad's world, at least.
Yeah, Chad's world.
Which is the only world that matters. So.
Well, you said it. All right, your last place pick was letter D. It's so cold in the D because you also picked Maker's Mark.
Okay. I'm not surprised.
Your third place pick is letter A.
Which is?
A is Jim Beam White Label, the 4-year.
I liked it better than Maker's Mark, and it's, what, almost $10 cheaper?
Correct. You picked an Evan Williams product in the 50 under $25
That was my
flight,
favorite.
the
Yeah.
1783. Do you want me to get you?
But it was a different Evan Williams product. It
Yes.
was the 1783, yeah.
That's what I just said.
Oh, well.
I'm going to go hand you your pick, which is C.
Oh, it's Evan Williams.
Yep!
Wow. Who knew? I mean, I'm not kidding. This was my very first bourbon that I ever had. It must be nostalgia, or I guess I kind of like Evan Williams products because I chose the 1783.
Hey, Heaven Hill Distillery. We know you like Larceny. We know
I do
you know,
like Larceny a lot.
You
That's
like
one of my favorites.
Henry McKenna.
I'm a big fan of Heaven Hill. I
You're-
might have to change my favorite distillery, my pick. I would say Buffalo Trace normally.
I think maybe, your upper end stuff, your E.H. Taylors, your Elmer T. Lees.
That's where
Maybe, Stag Jr., that kind of biz, without even going into the antique collection, is like your upper echelon. And then the bottom shelf, which we always say on the show, no bottom shelf shaming, is like your Evan Williams, your Larceny, which I wouldn't call bottom shelf, but let's
I
face
mean,
it,
we're
it's
talking about
$22.
Yeah.
Even the Henry McKenna single barrel is only $29-$30.
And that's one of my very favorites.
Oh, yeah.
So
Love that.
I guess, yeah, in the category of affordable, available bourbon, I like Heaven Hill products.
Mm-hmm.
And in the category of not available and not cheap, I would tend to pick the Buffalo Trace.
Buffalo Trace. Hey, yeah.
So.
So now let's do our awkward pose with our bourbons. Very good. And okay, taking it to another level. That's what she does. So that does it for this episode of Bourbon Night. Follow us on all the social medias at It's Bourbon Night. That is for Twitter. That is for Instagram.
Also, subscribe.
Subscribe. Please subscribe. Leave comments down below. Subscribe for more videos like this.
Let us know what you want to see.
Yes, let us know.
If you want to see something, let us know, and we'll try to do it. I mean, if we can, we have the resources.
Right.
We have the power. We can rebuild it. Thanks, Chad.
Thank you, Sarah.
All right.
And until next time, drink more bourbon.